previous session we had studied about to classify the object into a living and a non-living, and also we had studied about some criteria on depending on which we are going to classify the object to be living or non-living, right? And so those criteria were the growth, metabolism, reproduction, cell organization, consciousness, and responding to stimuli. Now this was classifying the organism as a living and non-living. Now since my earth, it shows a diversity, it has a diverse varieties of plants and animals and and also the unseen organisms which is present everywhere, or I can say that these are omnipresent, which is present everywhere. So to study about these organisms, it now becomes very difficult because we don't have any proper classification system in which I'm going to classify the organisms into some groups so that I can have a very easy study about the characteristics or about the similarities or dissimilarities within the organisms. So this had become a very challenging program for the scientists and for the researchers to study about the organisms. So what they did, they classified, or they started to classify the organisms into different groups, and these groups were made on the characters which the organisms share amongst themselves, or the similar or the dissimilar characters, or the similarity or dissimilarity of the organisms, whether it's animal, it's a plant, or also in plants and animals, whether it is mammal, whether it is carnivore, it is a herbivore, in plants also, whether it's an aquatic or it's terrestrial. So when I group these organisms into these different categories or groups, this will become very easy for the researchers and for the scientists, or even for us, to classify or to know the structure, to know the characteristic of the group or the organism, right? Supposing I have a plant which can grow only in water. So when I say these plants this grow only in water, means if this group had already been classified, right? If the group had already been classified as an aquatic characteristics or a plant or as an aquatic plants, so I have already classified characteristics of aquatic plants. I have a new organism which can only grow in aquatics, or which can only grow in water. So suddenly or automatically all the characters of that group comes to my mind, right? So I'm going to now look upon those characters which have been classified for that group, and I'm going to compare those characters with the organism which I have. If they have all these characters present within them, I can directly take this organism and put into that group, right? So this is how I have given an example of aquatic plant. That is how I'm going to classify the organisms or the new organism which I have into the categories which have been already classified by the scientists. Okay, so to classify the organisms into these groups, my scientists, what they did, they started looking upon the characters, they started looking upon the cellular organization of the cell of the organism. They started looking upon the nutritional behavior of the organism, right? So keeping these criteria into picture, my scientists or the researchers, they started comparing the organisms with from each other, and they started grouping the organisms based upon some different amount of characters into different groups, right? And this classification now made it very easy for us to study about a new organism, or study about groups of the organisms, or study about the organisms which have been given a proper characteristics, or which have been put into a groups, right? So now let us see what is the need of the classification. Since we have diverse organisms on earth, we definitely need to classify the organisms for their studies, right? So we have millions of organisms, and still we have only studied about the 23% or 18% of the total organisms or the total diversity which is present, right? Okay, so what is the need of classification? how are we going to classify the organism and how are we going to name the organism? Because after classifying the organism or after grouping the organism into some category, I need to name the organism also, right? Because this naming or the name of the organism will be known in all over the world, or the scientist which is sitting at this corner of the earth, which is sitting here at this corner of the earth, should also be known by the same, should also know the organism with the same name only. Okay, so we are going to classify the organism depending upon some of the characteristics, and then after classifying or keeping or putting the organism into that category, we are going to name the organism also. Also, naming should be done with certain or universal criteria or universal rules, which is given by ICBN and ICZN. We'll be studying in details about this in this session. So first, let us see, why do we need to classify the organism, or the need of classification? Okay, so as I said, we have a diversity of organisms present on Earth, and for the study of these organisms, we need to classify the organisms. Okay, so because of the diversity of the organisms, we need to classify. Second, also we need to study about the evolutionary relationship of the organism. Not necessary my organism which is now present is a very new organism on the earth, right? It can also happen that this organism which is now present have been evolved from some different kind of organisms. Okay, so this changes which is continuously evolving the organism and which is now present on the earth, this might happen that this organism have been evolved from some kind of organism through different stages, right? So I should also classify the organism so that I can have I can study the evolutionary relationships or evolutionary changes which evolutionary relationships occurred in this organism. So to study the evolutionary relationships of the organisms. Next, when the organism have evolved from some other organisms through different stages, definitely they are going to share some common characteristics every time, right? So, or they are sharing some common characteristics, and also because of some percentage of dissimilarities, they are getting evolved, or they are different from those groups, right? Or those ranks. Okay, so to study the similarity and dissimilarity in the organisms. Okay, so basically, why do I need to classify the organism? Because to study the diversity of the organisms, to study the evolutionary relationships of the organisms, and also to study the similarity and dissimilarity in the organisms, or the similar or the dissimilar characteristics in the organisms. Now coming to how I'm going to classify the organism. Okay, so let us now see how to classify the organism. Okay, so there are mainly 3 steps in which I'm going to classify the organism, and those steps are: first is identification and characterization. Second is nomenclature. Third is classification. Okay, so let us now study the details of these three steps. First, when I say identification, characterization, supposing I have a very new organism which have not been seen before by the scientists or which have not been classified by the scientists. Okay, so I have a new organism with me. Now I'm going to identify the organisms. How I'm going to identify the organisms? I already have the data which have been present with me, which have been done by the scientists and the researchers. Okay, so I have those data with me. Now I'm going to take my organism and I'm going to see the similar characteristics from those data, and I'm going to compare those similarities and dissimilarities with my new organism. Once I get a similar characteristics, or supposing I have got this group which is sharing some common characteristics with my new organisms, so I can have a chances, or I can have a possibility of putting my new organism into that group, right? So first I need to identify that group. I need to identify that organism. So that is my first step, that is identification. Now what is characterization? Characterization is supposing these characters, this group have these many characters, and my organisms should show a positive of that characteristics. For example, supposing I have an organism which have 4 limbs. Okay, these have 4 limbs and they have a body, fur also. So those 2 characters which I can see here in my new organism, and also those 2 characters is present in that group. So that is called as characterization. What I'm going to do, I'm going to compare the characteristics. I'm going to see the similar characteristics which my organism is sharing with that group. Okay, that is nothing but that is characterization. Now once I have got the characters or the similarities my organism is sharing with the group, now it is a possible I get a possible reason to put this organism into that group. Now I'm going to put that organism into a group. Again, after putting that organism into that group, I should have some name given to that organism. Okay, because I have compared the organism with similarities and dissimilarities. Now I should give a name to that organism so that it can be known all over the world with that name, and that is called as nomenclature. So I'm going to name the organism with the similar naming in that group, within that group itself. Okay, so once I have named the organism, finally I'm going to classify the organism. This classification, as again we'll be studying about this classification as in the taxonomical hierarchy. So I'm going to classify that organisms on the characteristics in different categories within that group itself. So that group is again divided into different groups depending upon the more of the similar characters it is sharing. Okay, so this is how I'm going to classify the organism. Okay, now coming to the nomenclature, which is a very crucial step in classifying the organism. This nomenclature, when I say nomenclature, I should give a name to an organism, or a single name to an organism by which it will be known all over the world. Any scientist sitting at any corner of the earth, he or she should be able to recognize the organism by its name itself. So I should have one common name all over the world, right? And that one common name is given by certain rules and criteria which is universally accepted. Okay, so let us study in details about the nomenclature. Very first step in nomenclature is keeping in mind the similar characteristics it is sharing with the other animals in the same group. So I'll be naming the organism with some kind of similar naming of the organisms in that group, right? So nomenclature was before it was, or I can say nomenclature is of 3 types, as polynomial, trinomial and binomial. So now which is universally accepted is the binomial type of nomenclature. What were the problems with these 2 different kinds of nomenclature, because of which the universally accepted name is only binomial nomenclature, or the naming with 2 words only. So let us now see polynomial nomenclature, trinomial, and third is the binomial nomenclature, and this type is universally accepted. Okay. Polynomial nomenclature is nothing but a single organism. It was given many names, maybe 12 to 13 words of a name. So this was very difficult for scientists or for a common man to remember that much big name for an organism. And this naming was basically upon the characters it was sharing. So these many characteristics, so these many words for each and every characteristics, they compile to form a very big name of 15 to 20 or 12 to 15 words. So the reason behind this polynomial nomenclature was just because of the such a huge name. It was very difficult for the scientists, even for a common man, to remember the name. Then came trinomial nomenclature, wherein there is 3 words in a naming. This 3 words is what? Supposing I have an organism naming, let us take an example of human beings. Okay, so the scientific name for this human beings is going to be my Homo sapiens. Okay, and I'll have the abbreviated form of the scientist who had given this naming to the organism. Okay, so this is the scientist Linnaeus. So abbreviated form of this scientist Linnaeus, and these 2 words Homo sapiens Linnaeus. So this was what? The 3 word naming. So this is called as trinomial nomenclature. This is also sometimes written, or this is also sometimes used while naming the scientific name of the organism. Binomial nomenclature is just these 2 words and not the scientist name. Okay, so this is the trinomial nomenclature, wherein we have an abbreviated form of scientist written at the end of the name, scientific name, and binomial is just omitting this side, or this scientific name, abbreviated form of the scientific name. You just have 2 words. Okay, so this is my binomial nomenclature. Now, while naming the organism, also we need to look into some criteria and rules which was given by the ICBN international codes. So let us see what are those criteria and rules to name the organisms. Okay, or the rules for the nomenclature. Yes. Okay, so the first criteria being, as I said, binomial nomenclature, it consists of 2 words, and these 2 words is the first word being the genus and the second word being the specific epithet. And this specific epithet is nothing but it's a species. Okay, so I have a name in which my first word will be representing the genus of the group or the organism, and the second word is the specific epithet, or the will be representing the species of the organisms. Okay, second, the word or the name which will be given should be in the Latin, should have a Latin name, because the first name which was given, or the naming when was done, at that time only the Latin language was used by the scientists, or it was only the Latin language was understood by the scientists. So it started from there. It started from that stage, that the nomenclature should be in the Latinized name, or should be in the Latin word. Now coming to the third criteria, my first word, which is the genus, should always start with a capital letter. So the first word or genus should start with capital letter, and the second word, which is the species or the specific epithet, it should always be a small letter. Okay, so this is the capital letter and this is the small letter. Writing this as, say, Sapiens will be wrong, and this is the right way of writing. So I have a genus starting with the capital letter, and I have, species is starting with the small letter. This writing in this way is the wrong form of writing the scientific name. Fourth criteria: when they are written, or when these are written, when these are handwritten, it should be separately underlined as I have done in these, right? And if they are typed, they should be typed in italics. Okay, so when handwritten, should be underlined separately, and when typed, in the italics. Okay, so when they are handwritten, it should be underlined separately and not like this. This is the wrong way. And when it is typed, it should be converted into italics form. It should be typed in italics. Next criteria: there is no comma or no full stop or no hyphen in between the names. So there should not be any special characters present between or put within the name. I should not have any comma, hyphen, slash or full stop in between this name. So there should be no special characters, means no comma, no slash, no hyphen, right? So I should have just a single space between these two names. Okay, so these are the criterias. These are my 5 criterias. Keeping in mind, I should name the organisms. So the first criteria being, the first word is always the genus, the second word is always a specific epithet, that is my species. The first word should start with a capital letter and the second word should start with a small letter. The name should be in the the name should be my Latin name. If the name is handwritten, the scientific name is handwritten, it should be underlined separately, and if it is typed, it should be typed in the italics form, and there should not be any special characters present in between these names or these two names. Okay, so after naming the organisms, now I'm going to completely classify the organism. I'm going to put the organism into that specific group with which it was sharing the characteristics, similar characteristics, and it was sharing also some dissimilar characteristics with that group itself. So we'll be grouping again the organisms into different groups within that major group itself. So we'll be studying about that in detail in the next session. So let us now quickly revise it. Why do we need to classify the organism? Because of its diversity. It was very difficult for scientists to study the characters, to study the evolutionary relations, to study any kind of studies on the organisms. So they needed some kind or some criteria to which they can have an easy study of the organism. So what they did, they classified the organism depending upon the similar characteristics or some dissimilarities they show with different organisms. So this is the major steps: how to classify the organism, with identification, characterizations, with nomenclature, and then finally classification. So nomenclature is again of 3 types, and the universally accepted is my binomial nomenclature. Means I have 2 words name given to the organism. So this is the criteria by which I have to name the organism, and then finally naming the organism, we are going to classify the organism into that group.